See a pin, pick it up, and all the day you'll have good luck. Pinning down diplomacy inside Madeleine Albright's diplomatic jewelry box. Madeleine Albright, America's leading diplomat as Secretary of State from 1997 to 2001, used quiet cultural diplomacy by wearing expressive pins during negotiations signaling positions on humanitarian goals, weapons cooperation, and NATO expansion. Her jewelry represented her perception of challenging diplomatic efforts on the global front while injecting levity and debate amid tense world situations. Cleopatra, Mark Antony, and a priceless pearl. Emperor Charlemagne and a golden ring. In ancient times, jewelry was viewed as an outward sign of connection between people. Kingdoms forged alliances based on jewelry, making it a colorful part of statecraft ever since. Albright leveraged this role of jewelry, acknowledging her diplomatic arsenal by saying, "The world has had its share of power ties. The time was right for the mute eloquence of pins with attitude." After escaping communism in Czechoslovakia and immigrating to America in 1948, Albright would become a diplomat with a unique geopolitical viewpoint. Mentored by National Security Advisor Brzezinski in the late 1970s, she would eventually be appointed as a United Nations ambassador and then as U.S. Secretary of State. Her position would be complicated during the post-Cold War world at the end of the 20th century because the monolithic threat of the Soviet Union would be replaced by a hybrid of threats that were harder to target. Her quiet cultural diplomacy unintentionally started in 1994 after the First Gulf War. As a UN ambassador, she was tasked with the daily denunciation of Saddam Hussein because of his UN weapons inspections refusal. The Iraqi press countered with the poem To Madeleine Albright without greetings, calling her an unparalleled serpent. Albright responded with a golden serpent pin.
The reporter says, "Why are you wearing that snake pin?" And I said, because Saddam Hussein compared me to an unparalleled serpent. And then I thought, well, this is fun. So I went out and I bought a lot of costume jewelry to reflect what I thought we were going to do on any given day. So on good days, I wore flowers and butterflies and balloons. And on bad days, various kinds of insects and carnivorous animals. And the other ambassadors would say, "So what are we going to do today?" And then it was right after the first President Bush had said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." So I said, "Read my pins."
In her collection of over 200 pins, many expressed her diplomatic goal of making the U.S. an indispensable nation. Albright believed that the purpose of foreign policy was to persuade others to do what we wanted, or better yet, to want what we wanted. The first challenge Secretary Albright inherited was that of the ongoing Middle East peace process. The quicksand of the decades-long negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis pulled the U.S. back in again after the 1997 terrorist attacks. The negotiations started with the dove pin, a gift from the widow of the former assassinated Israeli Prime Minister to signal a goal of Holy Land peace. It would then be replaced with a balloon with high hopes for a successful outcome. As negotiations intensified, a lion pin represented bravery for anticipated tough concessions. Meanwhile, turtles indicated that negotiations were dragging, snails signaled impatience, and a crab pin represented deadlock due to grumpy old men on both sides. A mushroom pin symbolized how sometimes diplomacy is better accomplished in the dark outside of media scrutiny. However, it was a major disappointment that no peace agreement was reached. On another diplomatic front, Albright had many pins for Russia. She wore a small arrow-like pin when the U.S. wanted to modify the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 1999. The Russian foreign minister commented that it looked like an interceptor missile, which encouraged him to negotiate, but the Kremlin accepted no changes. Later that year, a huge bug pin sent a message that spying would not be tolerated when Russia was caught bugging the U.S. State Department. Another pin that created a Russian diplomatic stir in late 1999 involved Vladimir Putin. Earlier in the year, as President Clinton's foreign policy team met to celebrate NATO's 50th anniversary, Defense Secretary Cohen, President Clinton, and Secretary Albright were sitting together on a couch. When cameras entered, Clinton clasped his hand to his mouth as a signal to end the confidential talk, and then Cohen and Albright covered their ears and eyes. Replicating the photo, Albright found a monkey pin that she wore to an important meeting later with Russia. Putin had denied human rights violations after its heavy attacks in the Chechenian region for suspected Moscow terrorist attacks.
And President Putin turns to President Clinton and says, "We always notice what pin Secretary Albright wears. Why are you wearing those monkeys?" And I said, because of your Chechnya policy. And he got furious. And President Clinton looked at me like, are you out of your mind? You are supposed to be the chief diplomat, and you have screwed this up.
Putin forgave the indiscretion, but Albright learned a lesson. Her pin didn't persuade Russia to stop the attacks, but it at least brought consideration for a U.S. humanitarian mission. Russia was not the only country that required skilled diplomatic efforts. During intense negotiations, Albright often turned to pins from her insect collection. Her bee pin sent a stinging message about the 1999 humanitarian crisis in Kosovo. It symbolized that if the U.S. was backed into a corner, it would use military force. She then wore a dove pin to debate her colleagues about using NATO airstrikes to bring peace to the Albanians, who were victims of ethnic cleansing by the Yugoslavs and Serbians. Many critics nicknamed the conflict Madeline's War. However, after the consequences learned in years prior from the Bosnian conflict, Albright knew that the softer policy tool of diplomacy wouldn't work. The harsh tool of military force was the only action Yugoslavian President Milosevic would understand. After months of bombing, he finally relented. However, Albright's success came with the price of civilian casualties and strained relations with Russia and China. The Kosovo War further deepened the debate over America's role as an indispensable nation.
Another challenge that Albright had to deal with was North Korea. In 2000, when she became the first in her position to visit on a diplomatic tour to normalize relations and address its missile program, she wore an oversized flag pin. Her message was that Americans were not evil, especially when one could stand next to their leader. Unfortunately, no deal was produced that would end Kim Jong-il's nuclear program, and presently the threat still looms. Our society continues to harness the power of pins today. For Albright, these recognizable instruments of diplomacy assisted her in making social, economic, and political impacts. One social impact made by Albright was to make foreign policy more understandable for everyone. She used her Pins of the People as an unorthodox way to reach and teach new audiences. Another social impact involved Albright as a woman. After succeeding Warren Christopher as the first female in her position, she accepted a high heel pin saying, "I only hope my heels can fill his shoes." She was able to accessorize her diplomatic positions through symbolic brooches at a time when power ties dominated the negotiations. She had finally shattered the glass ceiling, with Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton soon to follow.
On the economic front, Albright wore a dragon shard pin to help bolster the debate for normalizing Chinese trade relations and access to American markets when she appeared before a U.S. Senate Finance Committee. After a decade-long debate, the proclamation was signed into law in 2001. Albright also made an economic impact by ensuring fair trade from the jewel mines to the jewelry counter. She worked with companies like Cartier and Tiffany to protect exploited labor and gems in Burma by sanctioning much of the jade there. Additionally, she worked with Sierra Leone to thwart rebel groups from illegally profiting and fueling civil wars from the country's conflict diamonds. Albright's Diamond Panther pin represented this key diplomatic success known as the Kimberley Process, which still involves over 50 nations today. Albright also had many political successes in her tenure. She was even able to use her diplomatic skills to cross the political aisle. Her ally and Republican Senator Jesse Helms aided with the passage of the 1997 worldwide chemical weapons ban.
However, her greatest political legacy involved Eastern European NATO expansion. Being a Czechoslovakian immigrant made this policy success personal. Debate was intense, citing possible damage to U.S.-Russia relations, but the diplomatic actions of Albright prevailed, and Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic were welcomed as NATO members in 1999. She commemorated the event by wearing the same eagle pin she wore when she was sworn in. Albright worked tirelessly as the chief U.S. diplomat. Her Atlas pin, which communicated that America cannot shoulder the weight of the world alone, represented her idea of American diplomacy. She summarized the impact of her pin collection by stating, "I was fortunate to serve at a time that allowed me to experiment by using pins to communicate a diplomatic message. One might scoff and say that my pins didn't exactly shake the world. I can only reply that shaking the world is precisely the opposite of what diplomats are placed on earth to do."